Hi, I'm Angus at LabVac. Today, finally, I have on the bench an Edwards E2M30 and an Edwards E2M28. How do you manage that, you ask? Because basically from here that way, it's exactly the same pump. I mean, not similar, but exactly the same pump. Only the motor is different. The 28, which is how we know it here in the UK, the E2M28 is the 50 Hz version of the pump. In the States, elsewhere in the world, you get the E2M30, which is a 60 Hz version of the pump. Spins a bit faster, produces a bit more flow rate. That's the only difference. In point of fact, this particular pump that I've got here, which is badged as a 30, actually has a switchable motor. So there's a switch inside the terminal box here which allows you to alter the voltage, and the plate on the side down here tells me that it will run on 200 240 volt 50 Hz or 200 230 60 Hz or 115 to 120 volts 60 Hz. So it's a worldwide motor, switchable. Hence this is both a E2M28 and an E2M30. So that's the only difference there. Now this is the pump that I've had the most people ask me about. There's the 30, that would say 28 on a UK version. A lot of people asking for this particular pump. We see it on the back of a lot of mass spectrometers and other pieces of kit like that, and so it's a very popular pump. It's been around for decades. There have been changes over that time. There have been mostly fairly subtle tweaks to the design of the pump during that time. Bit bananaed, that side panel. Some of which we might speak about as we go. The main ones are kind of external. It's the sight glass, it's the sealing of the oil box, things like that have changed, rather than any of the internals. And just looking to see whether we've got oil in this pump, and it's a little bit dark to tell, so the surefire way to find out is to open the drain port and see what happens. The answer is nothing. That's good news. There is no oil in this pump. So we've got a little extension pipe that the user has fitted, or possibly even an OEM, an instrument manufacturer, that buys in the pump. I think with it being a switchable motor, it's highly likely that this has come off an instrument. So that's what was fitted into the exhaust. So it's got a regular drain plug and then an extension. Just get that out of the way, and then I can tip the whole thing up on end. Much bigger, heavier pump than the ones that we've been looking at in this series so far. So I guess I should say, caution with lifting it up and wielding it around. They are beasts. All the more reason to get the motor, which is a fairly hefty chunk in itself. Get that motor off, get the base plate out of the way, and we can start to look then at the pump itself. So yeah, a lot of inquiries about getting a video done on this pump, and it's just a case of waiting until one became available to make the video, really. Usually see quite a lot of these, but then we went through a quiet period on this particular model, working on other things, But here it is. So if you have been waiting, if you like what you see, then please drop me a comment. That'd be nice to hear from people. But definitely just like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff, so that a few more people will get to hear about it and find it. So that's the base plate out of the way. And we've got 4 bolts to take the motor off. Two-part coupling between the motor and the pump on this model, so it is just a case of undoing the bolts and lifting the motor off, or sometimes prying the motor off depending on how long since it was last serviced. You do have this contraption down here which you can't really see. I'll play around with that, which is a gas ballast intake. I'll show it to you in a second when the motor's out of the way, but just checking that that isn't going to foul as the motor comes off. It looks like we'll be okay. So off comes the motor, which is a beast in itself. We'll get that out of the way. And then underneath here we have the rubber coupling part. That is really just destroyed. This pump has been left for far too long between services, which is not uncommon, especially with something that's on the back of a mass spec. You know, they might not even be in the same room where someone is working, so they're very easy to forget about. We take the cover off the felt pad, and then we can get the felt pad out, which is saturated in oil. So this pump's been leaking for quite a long time, but hey, there's a felt pad there to catch it, so don't worry about it. Now we need to take the coupling off the shaft here. I just need to turn that because there's a grub screw inside, so we need to get access to that. Which really is a bit stubborn. So we can get a bit more purchase on that. Ooh, there it goes. Just loosen that off, and then that comes off. Oftentimes you actually have to get pry bars underneath to lift that, because they do tend to stick themselves on pretty well. Then we need to take the key out of there, and a nice tool for doing that is these face and pincers, pliers. It'll just grip it like that, but they're not serrated, so they don't leave gouges in it. And then this is that gas ballast inlet that I was mentioning, so we'll also get that out of the way. Like that. That's just a port where you can connect nitrogen if you want a nitrogen bleed for the gas ballast. Now, on these pumps, also applies to the E2M18, which I've already covered on the channel, but for the 28/30, the oil pump is here outside of the adapter. Most of the smaller pumps, it's on the inside of the adapter, so you would now be taking the oil box off and dismantling the pump. With the 28/30, you have to take the oil pump off first, otherwise when you pull the pump cartridge away from the adapter, you're going to break the valve or gouge it, damage it. So this has to come off right at the beginning of the process. So we've got 3 Allen head screws which need a 4mm Allen key to take them out. And then alongside two of those, you can see here we've got threaded holes. So what we're going to do, take the screw out of there, put it into the threaded hole alongside. Okay, we do that with two of them. And those are jacking holes. And as you wind the screw down into there, it bottoms out onto the backing plate. And as you carry on tightening them, it will, as the name suggests, jack the assembly off from the backing. Because having been on there for quite a few years, it's well and truly stuck in place. So as those loosen up, you can see that's now pulled that free. This carrier holds the outer shaft seal. You get different variations here. Sometimes you get a single shaft seal, sometimes you get two shaft seals in there together. This one is a single seal. So we're then going to use the same two screws to go into the next plate, which is the oil pump body itself. So again, we've got two jacking holes we can wind into. The other three holes here are just the clearance that the screws were going through in the assembled format. So I'm going to wind those down there till they bottom out, and then with a kind of half a turn or a turn on each side so that it lifts up evenly, we can jack the oil pump housing off from the adapter. Just keep going backwards and forwards until that feels loose enough to lift, which is not yet. This pump's very stuck. There we go. And that's the oil pump housing. Now, going by the colour of this oil, it looks to me like it's probably been running on Androl 555 oil, which is that colour. I would say it's slightly unusual to run the pump on that oil. It's not really what it's designed for. Androl is a thicker, heavier oil. That said, it's certainly not the first time I've seen that done, and I don't think there's any major problem with it. But I'll be checking with the customer as to what they want put back in. I would normally not use that oil. I would use Supervac 19. So that part that I've just taken out, that is the oil pump blade or vane, depending on where you are in the world. It means the same thing, blade, vane, vane, blade. And it sits in that slot down there, and it's only accessible in one direction in one position because the whole thing is slightly offset. If you don't remove that, this is a phenolic or a plastic. If you don't remove that before you disassemble the rest of the pump, what will happen is you'll be pulling that part through the smaller orifice where the shaft sits. It will go eventually, but it will take the end off the vane, and then you'll have an extra problem because you're going to have to replace that vane. So that's important, tip number one. And then we can just get rid of some of this oil so it's not dripping around too much. And that's it for that end for the time being. So we can now flip the whole thing over, remembering that it's still at this stage a heavy lump. And then we get down here. So one of the first common changes on this pump is the way the sight glass is. The original ones had a fixed sight glass like the rest of the EM range. When the RVs came out with their removable sight glass, they updated the 28. This pump continued and still continues today, but they did upgrade it to have this removable sight glass. So if we get the right size Allen key, which is a 5mm for this, we can just undo those two screws. We'll take the sight glass out at this point. I'm a big fan personally of the removable sight glass, because I do like a pump to have a clean sight glass so you can actually see the genuine condition of the oil, and the bonded in ones were extremely difficult to clean. So that comes off there. The sight glass itself, as the name suggests, it is glass, so you want to go carefully at that. It'll be well and truly stuck down to the O-ring underneath, and it's easy to chip the corners off it at this stage. So the glass comes out. So the glass is going to get reused, so that'll go into the ultrasonic bath a little bit later on and get thoroughly cleaned, and then that can go back in. And then underneath that we have this large O-ring. Doesn't look like an O-ring at this stage, but when you get the new one out of the packet, it'll be round. You just fit it into there, so that comes out of there, and that's the part that you really need to change, because that's doing the sealing. To be honest, very rarely see one that leaks, even at this stage when it's been a long time past. Sight glasses don't tend to leak very readily, but like I say, from the point of view of cleaning it, you want to take it apart anyway. We can take the fill plug. The drain plug's already out. That was right back at the beginning. So the fill plug comes off there. That'll get a new O-ring when it goes back in. And I also want to take the exhaust off there for the same reason. That's missing its O-ring altogether, so that wasn't sealed for all these years. There should be an O-ring on that one as well. This is a plastic fitting. It does have flats on here, so that you can get a big adjustable spanner onto it. Only use that to take it off. When you put it back on, it only needs to be hand tight with a new O-ring on there. Hand tight will give you a perfectly good seal. And with it being plastic, if you do put some welly on it with a spanner, you're more than likely going to crack it and damage it. So that gets us to there, and we're back with the 6mm Allen key to get the 4 bolts off that hold the oil box in place. Which again are extremely tight. And then we'll see the next change that we have on these. Some of these pumps will have a cork gasket sealing the oil box. Some of them have an O-ring. Again, it was a change that happened along the way. When you buy a kit these days, it will generally come with both the O-ring and the cork gasket. And this one has the O-ring. So there we go. This is a later pump. I hesitate to say later, because it might still be quite a long time since this was made. So it's a simple O-ring that fits into this groove around here. This is one of the earlier ones where there is nothing actually to hold that into the groove. These can be tricky to fit because they tend to fall out while you're trying to assemble it. Later on they did put little nicks all the way around here, various points that pinched on the O-ring and held it into place better while you were assembling it, which was a nice touch. Quite a major change to make, to change the casting of this whole oil box just to hold that in place, but much appreciated by people like myself who have to try and get the thing reassembled. And then we're into the pump. So this is what the interior looks like. End plate here, I'll tip it over. And we can see what's going on. So the first thing to do is take this covering plate off here, under which we'll find the springs and various bits and bobs that need to be dealt with. So we'll take those three out. And then that cover will come off, slide out of there. And then underneath, the cover plate itself has these three studs fitted, which pick up on the springs for the valves. So we've got three there, we've got two in the intermediate and the final vacuum valve. So those come out, those pads and springs should get replaced. We also have this wire mesh, it's like a very coarse wire wool kind of thing, which is there just as a barrier. It maintains a certain amount of oil, the oil that comes out with the exhaust of the pump. It just slows the rate at which it drains away, so you keep a film up over the top here. So that needs to be cleaned, but generally is going to get reused. It's unlikely that will be in your kit. We then have the gas ballast port through here with the non-return underneath it, which if we're fortunate we may be able to get out at this point. Otherwise we'll come back to when we've got the components separated. The screw and clamp will come off easily enough. Everything is a bit black in here, which makes it slightly harder for you to see exactly what I'm doing, but give that a wipe off. So that's the clamp that sits over the port here, and then that needs to be lifted out. So there is a little nook under there that you can just lever it up with. It's going to be tight in there because there are two O-rings sealing it, and you don't want to damage the part as you pry on it. So again, just take a bit of time to work that out, and there it is. Again, I'll give it a clean so you can see. So it's kind of like a banjo bolt. You've got a port through here, and then ports through the side here, and an O-ring above and below to seal the pathway through. And then down inside that hole is the non-return. It's usually just referred to as a gas ballast star because of the shape of it. What that does is it allows gas ballast air to come in, but it prevents oil from going back when the gas ballast is shut. It stops anything from going back up the line, so it's a one-way valve, non-return valve. So that's that out of there. Up here we have the distributor, and the distributor is critical to the operation of these pumps. It's the same basic design that's in all of the EM series pumps from Edwards. The distributor is common to all of them. It varies in size and dimensions from pump to pump, but the basic principle is the same. And I'm going to take the cartridge out of the adapter first, so we've got better access to that. So to do that, I'm going to flip the pump up on end, and we've got 3 screws that are holding that to the cartridge. So there's one down here. These really are very, very tight. I'm trying to keep some of that off my clothing. There we go. So there's one there, there's one on the other side, and there's one up here at the top. So the one up the top here is only accessible once you've removed that top cover plate. Oh, that one's not budging. I'm not a little fella. But, sometimes they get the better of me. It's really going to take some force to get that free. Which is not going to look pretty on camera, but there we go. So, really advisable to get your pump serviced a little more frequently than this one has been, I would say. Right, hopefully it's done the trick. See, what I don't do for these videos is pick and choose my pumps and prep them all in advance. Rather that you see something that's a little bit more like what you would actually come across if you were inside of one of these pumps for yourself. So those 3 screws are out, and now the cartridge should separate from the adapter. I say should. Obviously this pump's going to put up a bit of a fight. There we go. So there's our adapter, which essentially is the intake and gas ballast ports and the routing for them into there. And then we can start to see a bit more of our pump. So there's a couple of O-rings that are stuck there that will get replaced. Another little one down there. And then we're back. We can now get a better look at the distributor. Now, what the distributor does in the EM pumps, it distributes oil. So it's kind of responsible for maintaining the correct oil pressure within the pump. So the oil pump itself, which we've removed back here, pumps oil up to the distributor, and if there's too much oil pressure there, it will flood the pump. So in order to prevent that, the distributor relieves the pressure and maintains it at the correct level. What it also does when the pump's switched off is it's an anti-suckback device and prevents oil from being routed back out through the input of the pump. So with the spring removed and the centre bolt, there's a cover plate here that comes off. Underneath that we've got what Edwards refers to as a waved washer. It's acting as a spring. See, it's a crinkle washer that acts as a spring to maintain a light pressure down onto the unit. Then there's a pressure plate, and then there's the distributor rubber itself. Down through all of that is this piston assembly, holds everything together. So this is the distributor rubber, that's the part that actually has to be replaced. And then there's a body underneath that just lifts off. So that's how the distributor assembly looks. And we'll see in a bit more detail when we come to put the thing back together again. So now we're down to the basic cartridge of the pump. This is the next thing that needs to come apart. So we're back to our 6mm Allen key and our stuck bolts. So we'll get the end plate off. Again, 3 bolts for that. Swap to the ball end. Just wind those out. And the end plate generally comes off fairly easily once those 3 bolts are removed. There's nothing else there apart from the surface tension of the oil. So that part's relatively straightforward. Underneath there we've got the rotor and stator. Oh, just pull the vanes out like that. That's not always possible. Sometimes they can be difficult to remove. You can leave them there at this point and knock them out later with better access. And we're on to our next set of bolts to separate the 2 pumping stages. You are seeing a lot more of me in this video than usual. Normally you just get the hands, but I'm going to put the whole body into this one. So these bolts that I'm removing here, bolts, screws, bolts, they are all the same thread, but they are different lengths. So you need to, when you come to reassemble, get the lengths correct. Now, separating these 2 is normally the trickier part. But what we do have down underneath here, where you can't see, there is a slot provided to get a blade in there. So just pop that open, and then back up on top here you've got a similar position, and you can just work that away. This is coming apart fairly easily. They sometimes need a bit more effort than that. So that's the big end where a high vacuum is generated. Got a pair of vanes, or Edwards would be calling them blades. So who am I to argue? Just poke the other one through. So those ones don't have any springs in them. They just spin out like that. And then we're left with the 2 rotors and the stator here. So to get these apart, there's actually a bolt holding the 2 together. So flip that up on end. Right down the middle there's a bolt which locks the 2 rotors together, keeps them orientated. So this can be a little bit tricky. You need an 8mm Allen key into there, and then of course as you try to turn that, the whole thing is rotating with it. So one method, it's not definitive by any stretch of the imagination, But one of the ways that I found that works pretty well is to put a 6mm Allen key through the oil pump vane hole in the rotor. Let that lock down onto the bench, and then with the larger Allen key in this end, you've got something to lock it off and to work against. Now, don't go crazy at this. If it's not working, then another way may be necessary, because what you don't want to do is end up gouging the edges here and leaving marks that stop that from spinning.
Here's what you should do. So the bolt is here holding the two rotors together. Obviously this section, boom, would be in there. So we've got our 8mm Allen key that goes into the bolt. And the proper way to do this, what I should have shown you in the first place, is refit the coupling. So put the key in the keyway, refit the coupling, and then put a bar into the coupling and use that to hold it. Okay, so that's the correct way. That's what I should have shown you. That's what we're going to do. So bar goes in there. That means that I can hold this. It takes away any risk of doing any damage, and then you can lever against that to undo the bolt. And then the bolt will come out.
Oh, I got it there. Yeah, I have just. That's really tight. I think what we've got in this case is someone's actually Loctited the bolt in the last time it was assembled. I think generally speaking, I'd say I wouldn't Loctite this bolt, because the thing has got to come apart again. Obviously, if the pump had been in regular service right up until it was dismantled, then it'd probably be easier then if the pump was hot to remove that and break the Loctite. So there are ways to deal with it. But that needs to come out of there. Then you've got to get the two apart. It's hard to grab hold of this, and it's impossible to grab hold of that to pull them apart. So at that point, what I would do, leave the bolt in place but loose. Take a drift like that, put it into the centre of the bolt, give it a couple of taps, and what you should see is that you should start to open a gap, because with the locking bolt loose, the two halves should come apart. And there you can see we've just started to open up a gap. So what you can do then is wind the bolt back a little bit more. Knock it a bit further out, and looks like we're pretty much there. No wonder that doesn't seem to be doing anything. It's the wrong Allen key. Right, so the bolt's all the way out now. Should be able to just work those two apart. Starting to make quite a bit of mess. But that's the two rotors apart, and then down inside of there you can see, yeah, it's definitely Loctite in there. There's a roll pin set there. That determines the orientation of the two rotors to each other, which is critical. So there's the bolt, complete with whatever mastic was used there. I'm saying Loctite, I'm not sure it was genuine Loctite. That bolt should come all the way through now. There we go, so that's the big bolt that was holding it, and you can see the remnants of what was put in there. So we'll get that off to one side. So yeah, that roll pin lines up with one or other, either way round of those, and it locks the two rotors so that they're at 90 degrees to each other for peak efficiency. And there we go. That's all the major components stripped down from there. Now, there's one thing that I haven't mentioned. If you've ever worked on a smaller EM series pump, there's something glaringly obvious in here that you won't have seen before, is that this pump actually has roller bearings inside it. So these roller bearings, because everything, by the time you get up to this size of pump, is bigger, heavier, you're throwing heavier weights in rotation, where the smaller pumps get away with just having an oil saturated rotor stator combination. The larger ones actually need to have these roller bearings, so you'll find these in the 2830. They're also the same in the E2M40, E2M30 and on upwards. There's one there and there's one at the other end of the mechanism. Now these ones look in really nice clean condition. I'm just rotating it and I can feel that each roller is turning within the cage and the whole thing is turning freely. If they're not, then the next thing you would need to do is to actually pull the races for them, which are buried in here. You can see one here, there's another one buried down in there, and then replace the cage and the races all together. I'm not going to do that on this pump because it doesn't need to be done. I'll show you how I'm going to test that. Once the pump's all cleaned up and we're ready for reassembly, I'll show you how I test and verify that the bearings are good. But if you did need to replace them, this is a very good device. This sits over the bearing and then these plates slide underneath from each side. You can use these bolts to lock them down underneath, and then through these two threaded holes here you can attach a puller or a slide hammer and pull the bearings off in that way. If the pump's been serviced regularly, the bearings last for a very, very long time. They would not be part of a normal clean and overhaul type service, which is what we're doing here. They'd generally be part of a much more major full service. But those two bearings in there, they're the thing that really sets this apart from the other pumps in the lineup. So we do have down here the oil strainer, which is a mesh device that sits down in the oil sump, in the oil box. And so the oil that's picked up has to go through this mesh strainer. Depending on where you get kits from, you might have a replacement for that. It definitely comes in the major kit. Clean and overhaul kits, not so sure. It can vary. But if that isn't being replaced, then that needs to be thoroughly washed out. It's not a massively fine mesh, so cleaning it out is perfectly possible. It's sealed in place with a couple of these square section O-rings, which in this instance has been replaced by a standard round O-ring, which is great. And then around the rest of the pump there's a series of other sealing O-rings that give you a good seal on the mating surfaces. So all of those need to come out. There'll be some more up top here on the distributor. There'd normally be some down the back here. I think I pulled those away earlier, and then again on the other components. So I can go through and get the rest of those off before it gets cleaned. The next thing to talk about then is shaft seals in this pump. The outer shaft seal, which is the one that leaks, is in this carrier that we looked at earlier on. So that's got to come out of there. We've got good access to this because obviously it's a loose piece I can hold in my hand. So I'm going to get a bit of what is rapidly becoming very dirty rag just to protect my hand a little bit, and then this screwdriver's had all the sharp edges ground off it, so it's a de-sharpened screwdriver, and I should be able to just slide that in behind the shaft seal in the carrier there. That's interesting. That's very interesting. I think whoever serviced this last had a few ideas of their own going on. Maybe we're used to working on the other sizes of Edwards EM pump, because between the shaft seal on here and the carrier there is wedged a circlip, which I've never seen before and serves absolutely no purpose. On the smaller EM pumps there would be a circlip behind the shaft seal, but not on the 28. But it's making it very difficult for me to get that seal out. So method number 2, once you've created a gap, is to exploit it. And that's just letting me get behind the seal and drive it down and out of the carrier. And then, yeah, there's a circlip placed behind there. Now that circlip does come in the kit, okay? If you've got a good kit, that will be there, but it's supposed to be underneath the inlet. It's not supposed to be underneath the shaft seal. So that kind of adds up with the excessive amount of some kind of sealant that was on the locking bolt between the two rotors. So that's taken that shaft seal out. The other one, the inner shaft seal, is buried way down deep in here, and this one's difficult to get at. You can't really get good purchase onto it from that side to knock it out the way we did with the other one. What you really need to use for this is called a split collet bearing puller, which is a device that looks like this. So we've got a threaded part here, and as you wind the thread down it splits this collet open. So the way that works on the pump is you place it in through the shaft seal and then open it out, and as it opens up it will lock in behind the shaft seal. That one actually looks a little bit small for this duty, so I'll show you a different kit. Same principle, but this type is just larger to begin with, but again it has that thread that opens it up. So you've got to get a size that's going to fit through the seal and then open up behind it sufficiently to grab it. So it can be, I mean obviously all 2830s have the same size seal, but I don't know off the top of my head which one I use for which. That one looks pretty good. So sit that down through the seal There's a metal surface behind there it's latching onto, and then we need to wind this out. This seal's going to be in tight. Judging by everything else we've seen, this is going to be in there tight, so we're going to need to go a bit to get this out. So I'm just going to lock that in there to hold the body of the puller while I get on and tighten it into place. Has got it, but not sure it's got it quite tight enough. So what we're going to do next is just have a look at this, and we're going to put a slide hammer onto that. Slide hammer winds onto the split collet puller, and then we can hammer it out. And at this point I'll tell you, it doesn't always work. Not making a lot of impact down there, I'm afraid. But we're not done yet. This is where the real worldism of the job becomes evident. So what I want to try next is to tap it from behind. As I said, access is not good for doing this, but if the first option doesn't work, then you've got to try something else. So I can get that blade down onto the back of the seal. I think what I feared has just happened, which is that the blade has just gone straight through the seal without knocking it clear. This is well and truly stuck in there, so just take the puller out. Try and give you some other options. Obviously not everybody's got access to the kit that I'm using anyway. So we take that out, have one more go, tapping it from behind, see if we can loosen it that way, which gives you another option. Might go for a wider blade, provided I can actually get it into position, which I can. Let's turn the pump to try and get a new. Very tricky. Didn't feel good, guys. It's just tearing through the seal. Unfortunately, the seal's bonded to the metal surface better than it's bonded to itself. So the next option, one that I would always consider to be a final option, which is to actually drive down between the metal. Lift that up and see if I can give you a better view. Actually drive a blade between the rubber of the seal and the metal. This approach, as I say, kind of a last resort. It generally will work eventually, but it does run the risk of leaving behind some marking on the metal, which you want to avoid. So if you manage to get that lined up and then tap it in behind, what you can then do is work the seal from there and actually break the bond that's formed between the rubber. Now, it might be that if you don't have any of the other tools and options available, you'll go to this first and say, what was the problem with that? Why don't you do that all the time? But the reason is that you're running the risk of leaving marks behind in the metal. The seal doesn't matter. We're going to totally destroy this seal in the process, and we don't care. But what we're left behind with is the sealing surface that the new seal has to go into. So we want as little damage to that as we can get away with. So I'm in there now, and I can just keep working it round, folding the seal onto itself. Until eventually it sees sense and gives in to me. Once I'm in there, got enough of a gap, going with a bigger tool, which I can twist in the gap. And there it is. One totally destroyed shaft seal out. And if we look down there, That's gone pretty well. I don't think that's left any lasting damage there. Right, well, I just stopped there, just have a bit of a clear up and get rid of some of the muck and filth, because it was getting on my nerves there a bit. Final thing to look at then is what's going on inside our adapter. First thing we want to do is take the inlet port off. It just unscrews. So we'll undo that. We're going to get a new O-ring to replace that one. That one comes out. Join the pile. That all looks good. Then underneath there, we've got a filter mesh. So it's held in place by a circlip, which can be a bit tricky to get hold of. It isn't always easy, but we'll get there. There we go. Now that matches up with this one over here that I found underneath the shaft seal. I have had a little think about that while I was cleaning parts just a moment ago. And looking here, this is where the outer shaft seal runs, and this is actually quite worn. There's quite some grooves developed in there where it's been run just for too long. And the seal hardens off and cuts a groove into the shaft. Now, what I'm thinking is that circlip was put in here to move the position of the outer shaft seal so it would ride on a fresh bit of the shaft. So maybe it wasn't such an error as I first thought when I saw it. I haven't seen it done on one of these pumps before, but it is something that we do regularly with the Edwards RV pumps, and in fact they even supply a shim in the service kit exactly for that purpose. So I'm thinking that's why that was in there, and that it might not have been quite such a terrible idea. Okay, that said, gas ballast needs to come out. So the gas ballast control on this pump is this rotary knob, which will turn and turn and turn, but in truth it's only either open or closed. So we pop the cover off, there's a cap there, then we've got a screw holding the knob on. So we'll undo that with a 3mm Allen key, and then the control knob will lift off there. Underneath there then we've got this plate which is holding the actual piston that operates gas ballast. So we need to take 2 screws out of there. And then that plate will lift off like that. So we'll get those out of the way. Then we've got to pull this out. Now sometimes this will just pull out by hand, but rarely. So what I'd do at that point is to just fit the knob back on and wind that screw back in, and that gives me something to grab hold of to pull on the piston and lift it out. And if it still won't come, then it gives me something to lever against. Gently, because it is a plastic part you're lifting, but there you go. That much leverage, it doesn't take a lot to get it to come out. And there's the piston. The piston has a couple of O-rings on there which we need to replace. And it's important to note that this thread underneath is actually a left-handed thread. So when the knob is turned in the closing direction, it's actually pushing the piston and when it's turned to open, it's lifting the piston up. So reverse thread on that. You don't necessarily need to take those two pieces apart. You can leave them together and replace the O-rings. But if you are putting it through a deep clean, then you may well dismantle that and need to remember that it's a left-handed thread. There's nothing else for us to deal with underneath there. No springs in this particular pump. And then over to the side here, that's the port that I took that big fitting out of right back at the beginning. So we'll need to clean all the way through there, all of this, all of the inlet. And what I forgot to do after taking the circlip out was to actually remove that filter mesh. So this is generally fairly clean. There's a bit of dirt down there, so we can give that a clean out, wash it through with solvent, and then that will go back in when we reassemble. Another thing to note, over on the side here, there are various other fittings. On this particular customer pump, none of those are being used, so there's no reason to take those apart unless the pump was really thoroughly filthy, because if you take these out you can clean through. Other applications, you might have additional accessories attached on those ports. Essentially what they do is offer you a way to have external oil filtration, but it's rare to see. Most of the time you can clean sufficiently through the internal ports. So that is the whole pump stripped down. All the parts will go away now. They'll get all washed up and cleaned up. That's not going to happen for a little while because it is the day before Christmas, and these are going to wait until I've had a little holiday, and then I'll get everything cleaned up, back together. If you have to let a pump sit for a few days, as I am doing with this one, you're kind of better off not cleaning it and then letting it sit. You're better off to leave it in its current condition, because all these parts have still got a film of oil over them, and the oil will protect them from rusting in the time that they're sitting here. If you clean everything and put it in a box and then leave it for a week, then you'll come back and find that all the surfaces will have started to rust. It's not impenetrable rust, it's not problematic. You can clean it back off again, but you're essentially doing the cleaning process twice. So I'm going to leave all of this sitting exactly as it is, take a couple of days, and then come back, and in what will only be a second for you, we'll start reassembling.
Okay, so we're back with this Edwards E2M30/28, and everything's clean, everything's ready to rebuild. There are a few things that I wanted to go over just before we start the rebuild process. The first is the separation of the two rotors. So we've got now that everything's clean, it's a lot easier to see what's going on, so I thought it'd be helpful just to run over this. When I was taking the pump apart, I showed you a quick hack of putting an Allen key through the oil drive hole here in the shaft. Please don't do that. I shouldn't have included that, and I will go back and put a cover over that so that no one can see it. Here's what you should do. So the bolt is here holding the two rotors together. Obviously this section, boom, would be in there. So we've got our 8mm Allen key that goes into the bolt, and the proper way to do this, what I should have shown you in the first place, is refit the coupling. So put the key in the keyway, refit the coupling, and then put a bar into the coupling and use that to hold it. Okay, so that's the correct way. That's what I should have shown you. That's what we're going to do. So bar goes in there. That means that I can hold this. It takes away any risk of doing any damage. and then you can lever against that to undo the bolt, and then the bolt will come out like that. So please do it that way, don't do the silly thing that I showed you earlier. And then the coupling slides off, and there's the key that comes out. Keep all of that for later, and then the two shafts will come apart. This is still super stiff, but that's the first thing. Second thing that I wanted to speak briefly about, I did mention that there are various different models of oil box. Your kit is going to come with a cork gasket. If you have an O-ring on your oil box like this, cork gasket goes over there, not going to need that. And then with the O-ring seal, there are two versions. So this is an earlier version which is plain all the way round. Later versions have little nicks or protruding sections all the way around here that actually grip the O-ring. If you've got one of those, that's easier. With this one, there's nothing actually holding that O-ring in there, so it's going to fall out if I turn the thing over. It's also difficult to get this to actually stay in the first place. So early on, once you've cleaned the oil box, fit that and just let it sit there over to one side, just so that the O-ring itself starts to form to the position. That'll help you when you come to assemble it. Shaft seals. I did mention when taking this pump apart that there's some wear. This is where the outer shaft seals sit, down here. There is a bit of a groove on here. It's polished out pretty well. I don't think it's an issue. It did have a clip that the previous repair tech had put in there just to move the position of the shaft seal so it would ride on a separate part there. The alternative to that, the kit is going to come with two shaft seals, so what I'm going to do in this instance is to fit both of those, one on top of the other. It comes with two because it's common practice, again, on different variations of the pump. Some will have one shaft seal, some will have two shaft seals, depending on the route to market that the pump took. So in this instance, I'm going to fit two. That takes away any issues that I might have with some slight wear there in the shaft. And then the final thing that I want to mention at this point is these bearings, because these are the odd man out from the other pumps that we've looked at. So we've got these two bearings, one here, one here. I'm not changing them on this particular service. It's a bit of a deeper dive, a more major service where they would get replaced. Obviously what you do want to check is to make sure that they're good. So the bearing itself, it's a C3 type bearing. It comes with a separate outer race, which you can see is already installed in here. And then the cage and the rollers sit inside of that. And as it goes together, you will feel that it is quite loose. You know, it slides together very easily. The C3 type bearing has that extra bit of space in it to allow for expansion when the pump's hot. So when the pump gets hot, that will tighten up. So it's very important if you are replacing bearings that you've got the right type. I would recommend getting it from an official supplier to be sure that you've got the right one. Although it's a standard bearing, the fact that it's a C3 does mean that they're not, you know, off the shelf from your local bearing supplier. And then testing them. So this has all been through ultrasonic cleaning. All these parts are very clean. I want to know, is this bearing good? I mean, everything's moving nicely. What I'm going to do, put a bit of air across it. And you can hear it spin up it gets up to a nice high speed and gives you that lovely screaming sound, that's a good bearing. So if both of your bearings spin up like that with a bit of air across them, then they're good to use. They are fragile. We're going to need to be careful during assembly to make sure that we don't get them, if you put them in off center, it's very easy to pop a roller out of the cage, and then you're back into stripping the bearing out. If you do need to replace bearings on your pump, just a quick word on how you go about doing that. You are going to need a tool like this. This is a bearing puller. It sits down over the bearing, and then these two surfaces will slide in underneath. Let's just open that all the way up. And then these two halves will slide underneath there. You put the nuts back on, tightening underneath that to grip it, and then there are two threaded holes here that you can attach a puller to and pull it. It will destroy the bearing, which is why I'm being very careful not to actually do it in this instant. But obviously, if you've decided to replace the bearings, destroying them and removing them is not an issue. Then you have the race to deal with. If you're going to replace the bearing, pull that race out and replace that with the new one as well. Don't be tempted to leave the other one. To do that, you're going to need split collet pullers, which I've demonstrated many times. You put it down inside of here, it expands behind the race, and then with a slide hammer you can pull that out. It's pretty much the only way to get those out of there, because it's a blind hole. Need any more details on that, leave me a comment, but split collet pullers are the only way that you're going to do that. As I say, in this instant my bearings are good, my customer's not paying for bearing replacement, so we're going to carry on and start rebuilding. So I should mention that it's been a good week or 10 days, I think, since I stripped this apart, because we've had a big holiday in the meantime. Christmas and New Year has been and gone. My lovely children all came home to visit me and brought me all kinds of viruses, so my voice has gone a bit weird. Apologies for that, but we soldier on. So as is customary, let's have a look at what we've got in the kit. I've got an inner shaft seal, which we don't need just yet. I've got felt pads. Those felt pads to hide your oil leaks. I've got various bits of metal in here, so I've got a new oil strainer. I've got a couple of gauzes, which in this particular instant we're not going to need, but we can mention those later on. Springs, clips, all the bits and bobs that we're going to need for fitting valves and so on. I'll move those back out of the way until they're needed. Then we've got a paper gasket, which is for one type of sight glass. And then we've got our bag of rubber components. A big rubber gasket, which is for the other type of sight glass. We've got a rubber gasket for the side port, which isn't on this pump. So you can see the theme. We're going to have a lot of parts left over. Don't be daunted by the leftover parts. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've missed something somewhere along the line. It just illustrates that there are many variations on these pumps over the years. Got a couple of these square section seals. Those go with the oil strainer. And then we've got a whole series of O-rings that go in various places. That's our new distributor rubber, when we put the distributor together, and that's our gas ballast star. It's a critical component, very easy to lose, so I'll put that over there and lose it later. And then all of these O-rings that go into various places. I always say with these videos, this is not a definitive step-by-step process. All I'm doing is illustrating to you what goes on when you service one of these pumps. So there are lots of ways that you could go about putting stuff together at this stage. I'm going to get rid of some of these O-rings first. So I'm going to start with my oil box. Got my oil filler plug, so that gets a new O-ring. And that'll go in there. Not worried about tightening it up at this point. Got my exhaust port, which again gets a new O-ring. That one I can tighten up because that's not going to come off again. Only finger tight. The flats on here are for getting it undone when it's all stuck from years of use. So for building it, hand tight is all you need. And then move that out of the way, so it will fall off. Then I've got my sight glass and I've got my drain port. So the drain port gets a new O-ring. There are a few O-rings in similar size to this, so pick carefully. That one is a comfortable fit. There is a slightly smaller size O-ring which will go on there, but every time you take your fingers away it'll pop back off again, so choose carefully. And I can pop that in, make sure it threads in nicely, and that again can be tightened down because we shouldn't need to take that out again, but again finger tight, that's all. Now the particular sight glass that I've got on here, this is a later model pump which uses a sight glass that's very similar, identical to the RV series of pumps. This gets an O-ring underneath it, so again you're picking out the size that fits, which is that one, so that sits under there. The glass panel itself sits on top of that in that recess, and then the cover goes across the top. So these other parts are for different types, again not applicable in this instance. So then I just need to add the two screws that hold that in place. Wind those in. I'm going to do them little by little. I don't want to pull down on that glass element too hard in one direction and then risk chipping it or damaging it when I tighten down the other side. So bit by bit these screws will bottom out, so you know when you're done. And because you've got that big O-ring in there, they don't leak. So that's the oil box basically together and ready. I'm going to replace the oil box O-ring. Just let it sit. Try and help it to hold its shape for when we need it. I'll get that out of the way. And that's just reduced the number of O-rings here by a few. So, assembling the cartridge. First thing we've got to do is to reassemble our rotors. So I've got my two rotors there, I've got the bolt that's going to lock them together. And they have to go through this stator stage. Okay, the small end rotor LabVac rotor is slotted so the vanes can go in afterwards, which makes life slightly easier for us. We want to get plenty of assembly lubrication into this as it goes together. Got a jug of vacuum oil, and I'm going to make sure that plenty of oil goes into that bearing so that it's fully lubed up before it goes in. It's going to make a mess, not going to worry about that. And then you need to just gently feel it drop in. As I said before, if it goes in cockeyed or over to one side or the other, then there's a fair chance of catching one of the rollers and damaging it. You just want to be careful there. It all feels good, and then you don't want it to fall back out again. Now, to attach the high-vac through to there, that pin has to go into either of those two holes. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which one. It has to go into one because that locks the position of the rotors against each other. So again, we want plenty of oil in there. We want a hand over there so that it doesn't push back the other way. And this is going to be tight. So you've got to put it in, feel for the position of the pin, and then you can start to ease that together. Now, before going too much further, so that's nowhere near all the way in, but it is located on that pin. So I can now put the bolt into place. So that drops in, and I'm feeling to make sure that that screws in. It's gone in several turns. I just want to make sure that it goes in those several turns easily and freely. Then we've got to wind the bolt in, and it'll bring the two rotors together. So you can see that happening as I tighten that up. Okay, and that's just hand tight, bringing the two together. You'll note I haven't put any Loctite on that bolt. Some people do, some people don't. Again, I'm not telling you this is the definitive approach. I don't tend to Loctite that. I think it goes together tight, and as soon as you get some heat into the pump, it's going to lock up. It's not going to move. Never had one come undone. So there we are, but we do need to tighten it off properly. So again, only showing you the proper technique now. Fit the key into the keyway, slide the coupling on. I'm not bothering to tighten off the grub screw. It's not necessary to do this. Then I'm just going to rotate that until I can get a bar into it, and then I'll locate my Allen key back into that bolt, and then holding the bar to lock it, I can tighten that down. And that's the two locked together. Then the coupling's got to come off again, and the key's got to come out again. Give that a little bit of encouragement gently. There we go. And that is our two rotors fitted together into that stator, and then I can rotate that and make sure all is smooth and good, which it is. So, to build up from there, it's a step-by-step process. I'd like to get the end plate onto here. which means that I need to put the vanes in now. Pair of vanes there. I've honed the front surface of these as part of the cleaning process, so they're smooth and good to go in. These do have a channel in one side only, and the orientation of those, I mean, does it make a huge difference? The way that I install these is so that the slot in here is ahead of the rotation of the pump, so it's encouraging oil up to the surface to keep that film created all the way through. We're going to need new springs for those and pins, so I'll tip all that lot back out again. These are the springs, a couple of little springs, and then we also have support pins that go inside the spring, just stop the springs from kinking over. So those can be assembled. I tend to put one in each direction. Again, not convinced it makes the slightest bit of difference, it's just what I do. So those will go together like that. And then I want to put the slots opposing each other. I'll do that again. So there, that's how I'm going to assemble them, with a slot in each side, so that as these rotate, the slot will be pushing oil onto the face of the vane. So those will slot into here. Slightly tricky to get everything together without them falling apart. The rotation of the pump is this way as we're looking at it. So I'm going to install the vanes in that direction. So I'll get one side just sat in there, and you've got to compress the springs until the other side fits. Drop those down into place. And then I just want to check that the rotation is good, which it is. So with those in place, we need a couple of O-rings to go into here. And again, we're picking sizes as we go. There are lots of different ones here. So we've got the face sealing O-ring there, which doesn't quite want to sit in. So I'm just going to give that a little stretch. You want to do this gently, obviously. You can pull them hard enough to snap them, it's not too difficult. And we've got one small recess down here, which also takes an O-ring. Just sits in there. And then we make sure that everything's clean and good, and then the end plate can go on. I'll wipe off, there's a bit of muck on that face, just from where it's been sitting on the bench for a little bit longer than it should be. And then the plate goes on. Line up the holes, and then we can put 3 bolts in that hold that. And again, you see that I'm doing this by hand. I do all the assembly by hand because I want to know that those are all moving in smoothly. If I go straight in with an air tool, big old ratchet, if anything's askew, then the damage is done before you have a chance to realise it. So I'm just going to wind those down. nip them up. And they're not finished tight, they're just together. But what it does mean is that I can now turn the pump over and I've got a nice flat surface. I haven't got to hold it up the whole time anymore. Okay, step one. Now we need to prepare the other stator. So this is the big lump. This is a heavy piece. You can see down inside here there are quite a lot of marks in here that are visible, but I can't feel them. Running my finger over there, I'm not actually feeling any of that marking, but it's there. Always with rebuilding these things, you can have a very good estimation of how good it's going to be when it goes back together by looking and handling the parts. Until you actually build it, put it on test, you're not 100% sure. So this component holds the inner shaft seal for the pump, which is this one here. This has a metal outer. This is what we generally see for these pumps. Occasionally you'll get a kit where this will be a fully rubber coated seal. Not a problem. If it's supplied by a reputable kit supplier and they put a rubber one in there, I wouldn't be overly upset by that. You see them a lot on the smaller pumps. No reason it can't go into this pump, but this is a metal seal. So that sits way down there. Okay, so that's sitting right down in the bottom of there, and that's got to be driven home. So I can place it by hand, but I can't push it into position. I'm going to use a very standard set of seal drivers, bearing drivers. Kit looks like this. Essentially, choose the size that fits, attach the handle, whack with hammer. So that size fits nicely over there. You do need to make sure this goes home flat and true. Again, if it kinks over to one side, it suddenly becomes a big problem trying to get it to flatten out again. So what I like to do is use an oversized tool to begin with, so that the tool will then sit down on the solid metal outer, and that will force the seal to be completely flat. The particular kit that I've pulled out here, that's the next larger size. That's got a bit of damage to it. So I can't use that one, other than to sort of balance it down there and then drive it with the second one, which is not ideal. So once I've set that up, got it flat, I'm going to put the correct size tool on and then drive it. I'm going to move this onto another bench, because if I start whacking things with a hammer here, all this nicely laid out set of components is going to go flying. So bear with me a second. Just line it up. A couple of light taps to get it started. Checking it as I go. And drive it all the way home. So you didn't miss much while it was off camera, it was just me hitting it, but That's where it sits at the end of the day. And then you can see around here we've got the race for the other bearing. And that's now the inner shaft seal set. This is going to go onto here. We need to place the O-rings that seal between the two surfaces. So this is the largest O-ring in the kit. If we ignore the oil box O-ring that I've already shown you, that will form into the groove there. And then we've got some more of these small O-rings. You're basically going for the obvious recesses. Those should have an O-ring in them. And obviously you're also being guided by what you took out, where they were when you took it apart. So that's what I need in there. And then I need lots of oil on this. And then we're going to flip this over and lower it on. So I want oil in all the important places. I want plenty of oil around my bearing, so that that's well lubed up before it goes together. I'm going to let this oil run down because I also want oil between those two surfaces before they come together. Make sure that's all the way round. And then I've got to put vanes in. So these are the vanes that came out of this stage. Again, they're not being replaced in this instant. Again, they have a groove on one side and not the other. So I'm going to orientate them like that. They do not have pins. So there's no springs and pins in the LabVac side of things, which makes it a little bit easier to put them together. So those can slot in. Make sure that they move freely. And the advantage of them not having springs in this stage is that we don't have the pressure of the springs forcing them out, so we haven't got to hold them together. Normally you'll be having to grip this to push the springs in to compress them. With this particular pump we don't need to. Sit those in there so they'll clear the stator nicely as it goes together. The stator is doweled, so once it's lined up and won't go anywhere, so you haven't got any hand setting to do with this. So I've lubricated where I need to lubricate. I've fitted my vanes, I've fitted my O-rings. These ones are good tight fit, so they're not going to fall out onto the bench when I turn this upside down. Then I've got to lower this on, and the most important things here is to get the shaft to go nicely through the seal that we've installed and to sit onto that bearing. This chunk is heavy. Okay, it is heavy, so be prepared. You may have to hold it and jiggle it and do things like that. So just want to lower it down very slowly, making sure that nothing catches. And it's now down to a point where I can see the dowels are aligned, and that is on and in position. It won't be tight up. I'm going to put the bolts into it to draw those two together, but basically that is assembled. It may come apart when you flip it back over, which we want to avoid, having carefully lined it all up. So I'm going to get a hand right the way underneath, hold the shaft, so I'm not pulling on the stators. So you can see that that is together. There's 3 bolts that go in there. One, two, three. Now you could argue that if you hadn't put the end plate on at this stage, you'd have easier access to tighten those bolts up. I don't have a problem with it. I'm using a ball-ended Allen key. You can see the tip of this is formed into the shape of a ball, which means that I can come in at an angle, pick those up. If you've only got straight Allen keys, then yeah, you probably want to do these 3 bolts before putting the end plate on. So I'm just bringing those up so that they're touching. I've not tightened anything off yet because, again, I want to make sure that I get all three running in smoothly. If I tighten one thing down, it will pull it in one direction and it might tighten those, make the other ones run tight. So once those are down, I can just nip all three of them up. So that one's now tight. Not wailing on these, they don't need to be tightened down with every ounce of muscle that you can muster. Just tighten them off. And there we go. So that section is together. Next thing that I want to do, obviously, is make sure that the thing rotates, which it does nicely. And you can start to see oil. That's all the oil that was in there from assembly. It's good practice to only rotate the pump in the direction that it would normally run. Some pumps you can rotate in the opposite direction without any problems. Some pumps you're going to snag things and cause damage if you do that. So best to just stick to rotating it only in the one direction. So now I can go back to the end plate and say, yeah, that's done. So let's tighten those off to finished point. Again, it's not incredibly high torque on any of this, but just make sure they're solidly tightened off, and the pump is rotating nicely at that point. There we go. Back up onto its end. I'm not going for springs and all of that stuff at this stage. Next thing I need to do is to get the oil pump fitted to this. You want to fit the oil pump before putting the adapter on, even though you took it off before removing the adapter, just because in terms of alignment and getting it into the body of the adapter, that way round works better. So again, making sure that all my surfaces have remained clean. They do pick up bits of dirt, especially when you've got oil on the bench, because then you get oil on these surfaces and then anything that comes anywhere near them is going to stick. So cleaning all the while. And then my oil pump blade can go back in, again thoroughly cleaned up. Plenty of oil, that just slides into the slot. And again, always checking that it moves nicely. If anything does bind up while you're assembling, just stop. Stop and go back. Then I'm going to rotate this so that the vane is running up to down, if you like, because it has to fit into the oil pump body, which is here. Now, this component is going to sit so that these two slots line up with the two oil cavities there, and the smallest part here is going to be right at the top. So I'm just setting the vane. If I set it like that, this won't fit on. It needs to sit down here. And again, it is easy to nick and damage that vane by putting too much force in if it won't run freely. So there's a couple of O-rings that go into the body here. It's going to be those two. These ones are a tight fit. What I tend to do is put it roughly in position, push it home, and then that one's actually gone in quite easily. Sometimes they need a little bit more encouragement, but that's good. So that's those two in. That's all that I need for this. So then I can make sure I've got plenty of lubricant in there. There's not really any such thing as excessive lubrication at this stage because it'll all just get pushed back out as soon as the pump turns. So That can go in there, and then that's going to drop on there. Again, those two little ears there line up with those two holes, so you know the orientation that you're aiming for. You've also got the bolt holes here, which are offset, so they can only go in correctly. And I can see that's lined up. It sat straight down onto the vane, and it should sit flush around there. So that's good. Okay, apologies for all the breaks I keep taking. You don't see them, but you know, all those little gaps. I have to keep going, blowing my nose and coughing and all that lovely stuff that you get around this time of year. So the cover for this also holds the outer shaft seals, so they're going to go in next. They're going to go in that way round, so that when it's assembled, they're holding the oil on the inside, and they're installed into here in exactly the same way. So these are what I mentioned before, the rubber shelled seals. Those are a little bit easier. You can push them in. The nice thing there is, like, you know, just push that down so that I know that's flat and that's going in true. They're a different size to the inner, so I'm going to need a different size tool to drive them, which will be that one. And I'm going to do the same thing, remove it to my solid bench. And tap it down into there. That's not all the way home, I'll give that a little bit more, but I'm also going to put the second seal in the same direction. And then drive both of those home together. And there's my outer shaft seals. So I've got plenty of lubrication into these shaft seals, and then I can very gently work those on to the shaft, making sure that I don't nick any edges. They are very tight. Just encourage the seal out where necessary. These do seem to be excessively tight. I do wonder maybe that this has had a replacement shaft sleeve at some point in the past. So that's on. Am I entirely happy? I'd like it to not be quite so difficult to install as that, but what I do want to do is just move it around a bit like that to make sure that the lip is sat down in the right direction. Obviously, as you lift it slightly, the lip itself then will tend to tuck underneath into its correct position, and then everything should turn smoothly. And then as a last check, I'm going to get some extra light. I hope it doesn't mess with the camera, but I need to just put a bit of extra light in there and have a good look around that seal and make sure that it's sat down, which I think it is. We'll soon find out when we throw oil in it, put it on the test bench, and the oil pours out the bottom, and then we'll have to come back and look at it again. So orientation wise, we've got 3 positions for the screws. Just basically turn this arrangement around until they line up. Which they should do. And then again, always checking that these run in smoothly, that nothing's binding. And you'll see as that bit down, the whole thing tilted over. Okay, and that's why it's important to do them step by step. Because if you pull entirely down on one corner before tightening the rest, it'll never sit flat. So bit by bit. All the way down, and you'll feel the screws go tight when it bottoms out. Okay, and then what you're left with is a gap here. Okay, don't be scared. The gap's supposed to be there. Don't think that you need to then apply massive torque onto this to try and close that gap up. The gap is there and normal. So there we go. That's the major components back together. At this point then we can refit the key to the keyway, take away a bit of that assembly oil that's leaked out there, just to keep everything clean. Tap that home. Fit the coupling. And then do up the grub screw. So position of the coupling, essentially the end of the shaft should be flush with the face of the coupling. And that way you should have the right spacing when the motor end is attached to it. Just wind that up. And that's the major parts together. And then everything's tensioned up. Get nice smooth movement. We're throwing oil all over the place. Which is just what we want. So that's all good. So at this stage the order of assembly does matter a little bit. The obvious thing would be to assemble everything here, put the cover on. The problem with that is that that cover covers up the bolt hole to attach the cartridge to the adapter. So what we need to do at this stage is attach to the adapter, and then we can move on from there before we put valves into place. What we can do though is assemble the gas ballast non-return and the distributor. So gas ballast non-return is essentially this little banjo fitting. So it's clear through here, and then there are very small holes on the side here that allow the gas to pass through. Underneath it down there is what we call the gas ballast star, which is the actual non-return valve part of it. So when the gas ballast is turned on or the pump's running, this star will be pushed down and allow the airflow past this bottom hole and into the pump. When the gas ballast control is closed, there will be oil pressure on the back of this, and that will push it shut blocking that off and stopping the oil from going back up the passageway and out the top of the pump. And I can see there's a bit of, it's got it, I think. There's just a little bit of Scotch-Brite material that's got left behind on there. There we go. So this needs to have two O-rings. This is that in the centre there is the channel that the gas passes through. There needs to be an O-ring on either side of that. So back to our little pile of O-rings. And we look to pick out the ones that are right size. So I don't know how well you can see that, but I've got a bunch there that are small. Those all fit the various gas and oil pathways through the pump. Those are the ones we've been using up to now, all the small ones that have been fitted. Then we've got a pair here that are slightly larger. If I put them side by side, you can see that this one is slightly larger than the small set, plus we've only got two of them, so those are going to be the ones that go onto here. Small O-rings are much more difficult to fit than large O-rings, but we can just squeeze that on there, and then the second one can go all the way over the top. Down onto there, and then it'll stick in the middle there. And then just got to roll it over. And there we go. That's the two into position. Lubricate both of those so that they'll slide in. And then our gas ballast star needs to go in. This kind of has a flat side. It's stamped out a sheet, so it has a slightly flatter side one way than the other. And you want the flat side to come up underneath that. Now, in terms of putting it into position, it needs to be in there flat before you fit the cover over it. And it needs to be, oh, there it is. It's very, very easy to lose these bits. Fortunately, I do have a bag of them if I need them. So I use tweezers just to make sure it sits in there flat. But as you can see, operating the tweezers is a little tricky. And then hopefully you can see down in there, I'll throw a little bit of extra light in there. Sitting down there flat in the bottom of that recess. Then the cover goes over the top of it. Push that home all the way. And then there is a clamp that sits over that to stop it being pushed back out by the oil pressure. So that sits down in there. Find the screw hole and then just set that so that it's centered off. And that's the gas ballast non-return. The actual gas ballast line on this, I don't know if you've watched any of the videos on the smaller Edwards EM pumps, they used to have a copper pipe that came from here up to the adapter. This is all internal on this pump, so the actual pathway is machined inside the body of the pump. It comes out up here. So that's that part, and then the distributor can go on. Now again, looking here, you can see there's a couple of those recesses for O-rings. So a couple more of those small O-rings get used up underneath there. Make sure they're flat, and then the body sits over fairly obviously. Those two holes need to fit over there. It does have a pin here which goes into the blind hole, and then this slot here sits over the restrictor there. So it will only go on the correct way, and you can feel when it's sat down. It's loose on all of those, but you can feel that it's sat down over the correct places. The rubber goes on next. You can sit there. And the piston, again, you can see the centre of the piston protrudes. And that actually needs to sit within that hole in the rubber. So that sits down like that. Then the backing plate fits over the top of all of that. We'll put our new waved washer over there. And the cover. And then the beefy spring there sits over the piston. And that's the original screw, which has just been cleaned up. Sits down through the middle, and with a bit of luck we'll line up with the centre hole. Just compress that spring to move it out of the way, and then yeah, that's gone in nicely. And then you can tighten that all the way. It will bottom out, and once it bottoms out, that's the position it needs to be in. It's under pressure from the spring, it's not going to come out. So again, we're not wellying on it. I just set it up like that. That's how that goes together. And then when the cover goes on, that's going to sit through the middle there. So we now need to assemble this onto the cartridge. Sorry, that is the cartridge. We need to assemble the cartridge onto the adapter. I try very hard not to say thingamy and what's it, but it's easily done. So again, a load of O-rings need to go in here. This is another one of those ones that's generally a bit too tight. So a gentle stretch. And that will fit. Then we've got one that goes there to seal the inlet. That one sits nicely. And a few more of these little fellas. There are a few holes here. The threaded ones obviously are bolt holes. We don't need O-rings on those. We just need them on the two here that have the recess. Some models of this pump will have two more holes here. This has this slot design, slightly different. Some will have recesses to fit two more O-rings there and there. This particular pump doesn't need those, it's just those ones. So with those in place, we can introduce the adapter. Now because we've already fitted the oil pump, everything's going to align. We've basically got to pick up these three bolt holes and we're good. This whole assembly is very heavy. Can't reiterate that. Don't stick your fingers underneath, because when it aligns and drops down, it'll really, really hurt. Everything's bolted together solidly, so I'm going to grab it by the top end here and hold it like that and lower it in. And then I'm going to just eyeball the positions of those bolt holes. Now it's sitting on those O-rings that we've just installed, so it feels a little bit loose, which is normal. It will feel a little bit loose until those O-rings compress down into the grooves. So the crucial thing is, as always, that these bolts all run in smoothly. These are stainless steel machine screws going into aluminium threads. If they're misaligned or overly tight, stop and go back, because the stainless steel hardware is going to rip out the threads from the aluminium if they're cross-threaded or if there's debris in the holes. And the trouble is the aluminium part is the one that's really expensive to replace, whereas the hardware, not so much, but that's the way of things, isn't it? And then we're just going to tighten those down evenly all the way around. Okay. Knock a few things over, it's always good for the nerves. And then I can just show you how that all sits together now. We should still have free rotation there. Still got some assembly oil popping out. Don't worry that you're not seeing oil coming out of here. Remember, there's no springs on those vanes, so until this thing is flying around at high speed, the vanes aren't going to throw out. So they're not really doing a lot in terms of contacting the outside of the stator. But there we go, that's what we've got so far. Now, we can now put the cover plate in. So there's a number of things to go in here. One is our wire mesh, which just looked like a black ball when it came out. I've given that a clean. That sits here, and it just controls oil flow pretty crudely. And then we've got our springs. There are a number of springs provided, and they're slightly different. So you've got these that are slightly more open, and then one that's a little tighter. Now, they go, I think, fairly obviously. These two ports are effectively a common valve. So we're going to have the two matching springs are going to go there. So these pads drop in. And then the spring sits on top. Sometimes the springs will sit on easily and you can do them like that. Sometimes the springs are a little bit tighter and you need to actually push them onto the pad first, and then they'll hold the pad while you put the two into position. It's just machining tolerances, nothing more than that. And that goes in there. One other thing to say, these pads are green. Sometimes the pads will be black. Sometimes all those black O-rings we've been using will be green. The colour doesn't really indicate anything. Some companies will only use green coloured Viton, for example, so that you can identify that all their green O-rings are Viton. But that doesn't extrapolate to all Viton O-rings are green. They can be any colour. You can have brown, you can have green, you can have black, and they can all be exactly the same grade of Viton. So again, don't be put off by the colour of things. It's not as critical. Again, if you bought your spares from a reputable source, they will be the right material. So with that done, the valve's in place, our distributor is all in place, we've got our diffusing block. Then we need to get this plate in, and the three studs on the plate have to line up with those springs. So you're going to have to get down on your knees so that you can actually eyeball those and make sure that the springs pick up on the studs, because otherwise the thing is not going to work. So that's all three of those in position. Just let that sit down. And then I've got three small screws that go through there and hold that together. Tighten those off. And we're getting there, we're getting close. Back up onto its end, over that way. The coupling actually extends beyond the adapter on this pump. So when you put it up like this, it's going to wobble around a bit because it's only sitting on the coupling. But we just need to do that so that we can put the strainer in place. The strainer has a clamp that holds it. The clamp's held by that screw there. And these are our square section that I mentioned earlier. So one of those, let's turn this, I don't know, no, you still can't see it particularly well, but if I tip the pump over, hopefully you can see now. So this is where the strainer sits. So one of those square section seals pushes home into that recess. The strainer will sit on top of that. The second seal sits on the outside, and then the clamp goes over all of that, and the screw locates into this hole right down here. Hopefully you can see what's going on there, but when you do it on your own pump, it's fairly obvious. And we need a 4mm Allen key. Locate all of that into position. These are an extremely loose, crude fit. So there's lots of adjustment. You know, you can move the whole thing around quite a lot. It never looks like it's going together particularly well. That's just how they are. Truth be told, if it's in there, it's going to do some straining, isn't it? It's going to stop any big lumps of debris from getting drawn up into the pump. So don't be overly concerned about these massive gaps that we've got all the way around there. That's just how they are. So that's the strainer in place. We've still got quite a few bits and pieces left over. Like I said, there's still some stuff that we're going to use, but don't be overly concerned about the leftover bits, because you're going to have some, because the kit covers the various different models that have been released over the years. So we've got this far. The next thing we need to do is to get the oil box onto there and close that off. If you had the cork gasket model, you would drop the cork gasket over here, put it onto the face, put the oil box on, bolt it up, finished. We don't. We have this one. If you had the O-ring with those little notches that crimp the O-ring in place, then again, push the O-ring in, put it on, bolt it up, no problem. We have the one that came in the middle, which allows the O-ring to fall out. So if I now turn that, that's what's going to happen. So it's tricky to line this thing up. There are a number of things that you can do. The first one that I'm going to try is to put some oil into the groove. Not a lot, because I don't want to have oil all over the outside of the pump, particularly when it's done. But with a bit of oil in there, a bit of oil on the O-ring itself, if we're lucky, the tolerances are on our side, that might just be enough. The surface tension of the oil might be enough to hold the O-ring in the groove just long enough to lower it onto the pump. So I'm going to try that. Keep your fingers crossed. There we go. I'm going to look all the way around that. If it did fall out in any position, there'll be a lump of rubber, or it'll be cockeyed, it won't be sitting flat. That looks good, so I'm happy with that. If you have one that just won't stay in place, You could use some high vac grease, which will sort of bond that in place. Don't use a lot, just use enough to hold the O-ring in place. You could, of course, leave the oil box the other way up, put the O-ring into the groove, and then pick up the whole pump, turn it over, and lower it into place. Again, I say again, it's heavy, that's difficult to do, and all of the bolt holes will then be underneath. So you've got to fiddle the bolts up from underneath to get them to catch. It's not ideal, but that would be the last port of call. I've been fortunate here that oil was just enough to hold it in place. So I can move on, drop the bolts in, my 6mm Allen key. And again, I want to be really careful. These are stainless steel machine screws going into aluminium threads. They have to go in smoothly from the off. And then you want to tighten them down in a crisscross pattern, little by little, keeping the pressure even all the way round so that everything lays down flat. And then once they tighten off, we can just go round and give them a good pinch up. All the way round. All right. I want to clear away a bit of the spilt oil that's still on the bench. And then flip this around so we can continue with our assembly. Pumps all in, turning smoothly. It's starting to sound like a pump now. Great. So we've got our gas ballast to reassemble and our inlet to reassemble. I'm going to do the gas ballast first. This is the main piston that drops down into here. This is the eccentric. You'll remember, whatever it is, 14 hours ago when this video started, I did mention this is a reverse thread. So to screw this in, you turn it the opposite way. So tighten that up. I'm turning it anti-clockwise. Okay, and that controls the position of the piston. Piston needs 2 new O-rings. So we go to our finally diminishing pile of O-rings, and we pick out the ones that go in here. These are the fairly skinny ones. So that one is going to go in there. That looks too skinny to me. And again, you know, the design changed over the years, so you're going to have things that might fit but don't really within your kit. And I've fallen for that one. I'm just going to gently lift that out. I don't want to damage it in case I do need it. And there we go. That one's too big. Right, there we go. I've had a little bit of a fiddle around with that. I've got those, I think, the right way round. Now the other thing to note here is that this is eccentric. Just take that out so you can see that hole is not central on there. Neither is the hole in here. So when we assemble this, we have to align it, because when the cover plate goes on, these two holes are in line with the centre. So that aligns this. We just have to set it round there. So it's going to go in like that. A little bit of oil on those O-rings to let those drop in. Align it from the start. It's very difficult to turn it. Obviously we're holding onto a piece that's threaded, so it's really difficult to turn it if you haven't aligned it in the first place. So best to do it early on, and then it will just pop home like that all the way down. Then the cover plate fits over the top of that whole assembly, which should then line up with the two screw holes. And thus, if it doesn't line up, pull it out, do it again. The exact position of the screw into there at this point, not massively critical. Make sure it's got a good few threads so that it's holding on, but don't worry too much. That sits down on there, and then the knob will go on top with its screw. This is square cut to fit on the square here, so you want to make sure that that aligns. If it doesn't, and you just welly on the screw and pull it all together, you'll find after a little while that it just works loose. And then we should find that this will turn, and as that rotates, what's happening is the reverse screw in there is pulling and pushing on the plunger, moving it up and down. The gas ballast is only open or closed. Despite having this huge amount of rotation available, it's only either in a position where it blocks the gas ballast or allows the gas ballast through. When the pump is running and you turn that control, you'll suddenly hear the sound of the pump change as the gas ballast opens up and a lot of more air is going through it. You can stop turning then because it's open. Cover goes down on top of that. That's our gas ballast reassembled. The inlet port, which on this particular pump is this device, that just screws into here. I'm not going to do that now because when I come to fit the motor, that's going to be in the way. So that will get put on once the motor's installed. There's a cutout for that to fit through when we do that. I'll put that to one side for now. The inlet. That's our inlet. This gets a new O-ring. Sits around there. Then we have the strainer. You didn't get a new strainer, this is the original strainer, but look how clean it is. I gave that a good clean out. That drops down into there. And then the circlip goes in on top just to stop that strainer from popping up or moving around, particularly when the pump's turned off. And these clips, you saw how difficult it was to remove. It's going to be equally difficult to get it in. Just compress it and try and lower it all the way down in one go. Because it's easier to do while it's compressed and to try and mess with it afterwards. Okay, that's down, not particularly well, but it's down. There we go, that's better. That's got it all the way in. So that circlip's down in there, and then the inlet port will just screw in. There we go. Again, careful as you go, easy to cross thread, stainless steel into aluminium, etc, etc, etc. Hand tight, the flats are for taking it off, not for putting it on. All those things. There we go. That pump is basically built now. And it sounds like it's going to be happy. So, the last few things, we need a motor on this pump, so we need our coupling rubber, spider, whatever you call it. Drop it in there. I like to just turn the pump so that I've got the open notch for the motor coupling straight up, just so I know where it is. Don't make any difference, but that's how I do it, just so I know where the alignment's got to be. And then the motor will drop onto that. Big heavy motor. Bring it over here. So you want to get the couplings aligned and then lower it into position, trying to avoid destroying your fingertips in the process. I do find with some manufacturers couplings they use a harder spider in there which goes in easier. Edwards ones particularly, they tend to be quite soft, which means that they squidge down, which is the technical term. What you can see is going on here is that's binding up on the rubber somewhere. Okay, I don't want to just force it down because that's going to distort the rubber. So what I'm going to do is get down to eye level and look through. Look for any lobes on there that are catching and just try and release them. So I can see over here that that one isn't sat in, and there it is. So I'll work my way round, just looking for anything that has caught up, and just using the flat of the screwdriver to just push it out till it engages properly. You can't get into the top, so to check that top one, I'm going to rotate the pump using a finger on the fan blade. Top one's okay. Okay, and now you can see that it's sat down. It's still a little bit tight on those, but I know they're all lined up, so we're good. So we can bolt the motor into place with those. Down here, which, yeah, I see, you can't see that at all yet, can you? Sometimes think that having a mobile camera would be good, but the problem is, for every one moment that it's in the perfect position, all the rest of the time it would be in the wrong place. Usual game here, just work round each of those in turn, bring it down, should go easily. If you find that the bolts feel like they're bottoming out, but the thing is still not actually contacting face to face, then it could be the rubber element is still not in position. Could also be that the couplings are not in the correct spacing on their respective shafts, and so they're hitting each other before the thing comes together. So you just want to go back and check that. Now, I will tilt all 48 kilos or whatever this thing weighs for your benefit, so that hopefully I'll be able to just show you. No, can't see it at all. I'll find another way. So base plate. Base plate fits onto the bottom of the pump. Last chance to give it a bit of a clean. I didn't do anything with the motor. So the motor's actually going to need a bit of a clean off camera afterwards. But what I want to do is get the base plate installed. There are 4 screws on this, 2 each side. They're offset. Likewise, you'll see on your pump. The result is that this can only go on the right way round. So we just wind those bolts in. I'm fighting the urge to say it again. Stainless steel bolts into aluminium threads. But there we go, that's the base plate fitted. And I can tip the pump over and then I can show you where the gas ballast inlet is. Not that I need to, I think it's blindingly obvious really, but I've got a slightly slippery bench coupled with a very heavy pump. Result, lost fingers. There we go. That's the pump. What can we see? Down here, through the motor plate, is where our gas ballast fitting goes in. So line that up. These come again in all sorts of different varieties. Some banjos, some different stuff, you know, just a variety. And then on some of them you won't have a fitting there at all, and what you will have is these gauze pieces and the circular pieces of felt. Okay, and those go like that, gauze, felt, gauze, and they push in and usually have a circlip just to hold them in place, just as a very coarse filter. So again, varies a lot from the exact pump to pump model, depending on what you've got. That is pretty much everything together. I haven't installed the felt pad, which goes in here underneath the coupling. The reason being, I'm going to run this pump. We had those little issues around the shaft seals being a little bit tight going on, that issue of the groove on the shaft sleeve. So I actually want to run the pump, give it a few hours, take the motor off, check that I haven't got a leak, and at that point I'll fit the felt pad. I tend to do that with most pumps, just to be on the safe side. Obviously, you don't want to ruin the felt pad if you have got an issue. So I just leave that out for the time being, and it'll go in when I take the motor off to test it. So that's the pump built back together. It will now go over to the test bench, where it will, let's cover up the customer name there, where it'll get several hours running. Then, as I say, check it out for any leaks and so on. Then it'll get the side flashes back on and be done for the customer. So I'll add something on the end just to tell you how it got on. If you found it helpful seeing this stripped down and rebuild, I would greatly appreciate it if you would leave me a comment. It's nice to hear from people. Subscribe to the channel, like the video. That just helps push it out so a few more people get to see it. Cheers. So there is our Edwards E2M30 vacuum pump, running nicely. It's been on for a couple of hours now, solid at 1 × 10⁻⁻3, no sign of any shaft seal leaks. So I'll need to take the motor off, fit the felt pad, and that's good to go. Thanks for watching.